Ladies and gentlemen, this is going to be our next video on evolution, and we're going to be doing an introduction to speciation. Let's get started on this next video. So what do we consider a species? If we look at these two bugs here, are these the same species? Well, the definition of a species, it's defined as a group of individuals that actually or potentially interbreed in nature. So in the sense here, a species is the biggest gene pool possible under natural conditions. But the key here is they have to be able to go through and interbreed. So if we're looking at this, they have to be capable of going through and interbreeding. And two, from this, they have to be able to produce fertile offspring in nature. So are these beetles of the same species? Well, they look very similar if we're looking at the image here, but the only way that we can go through and classify them as the same species is if they're able to produce fertile offspring. So how does speciation occur? What we have here is we're going to look at a cladogram. We have three different sets of flies here. And each of these flies, may appear to be very similar, but they cannot go through and reproduce and create fertile offspring. So from the naked eye, they go through and they look similar, but they're not capable of producing fertile offspring, so therefore they are not of the same species. Well, how does an event like this go through and occur? And where do these speciation events go through and occur? But more importantly, what has to occur in order for an organism or a population to go through and diverge? We've been throwing around all this vocabulary thus far, but we want to really be able to figure out what it all means. So what we're going to look at is kind of a story. We're going to look at the story of some fruit flies and kind of go through the plot and the timeline to really kind of delve into how this goes through and happens. So what we're going to do is follow this population of flies on a banana. Population of wild fruit flies is minding its own business on several bunches of rotting bananas, and they're going through and cheerfully laying their eggs into this mushy fruit. So we can pay attention to the coloration of these flies, and we can see that these flies are fruit flies feasting on this banana here. Now, disaster is going to go through and strike, and a hurricane is going to wash these bananas and the immature fruit flies that they contain out to sea. And this banana bunch eventually washes up on an island off the coast of the mainland. The fruit flies mature, and they emerge in their slimy nursery onto that lonely island. The portion of the population, the mainland of the island, are now too far apart for gene flow to unite them. And at this point, speciation has not occurred yet, but the fruit flies cannot go back to this mainland to go through and mate. So they're only going to go through and mate with the flies on this new island and produce healthy offspring that are separate from these mainland flies. So now what we see here is what we call divergence. The ecological conditions are slightly different on the island, and the island population evolves under different selective pressures and experiences. So different random events occur on the mainland as compared to this island. The morphology, the food preferences, and the courtship displays change over the course of many generations of natural selection of each of these flies. Now, another storm is going to reintroduce the island flies to the mainland, and they will not readily mate with the mainland flies since they have evolved different courtship behaviors. The few that do mate with the mainland flies produce inviable eggs because of their genetic differences that have now occurred via natural selection between the two populations. So now the lineage has split, and now the genes cannot flow between these populations. So an event that we just went through and discussed is what we call geographic isolation. We have a population, and a barrier is going to go through and prevent and separate these two populations that have now diverged from going through and reproducing. Now, over many, many generations of natural selection, what we're going to start seeing is genetic differences between these populations. And eventually, when they can no longer reproduce, they now have gone through what we call a speciation event, where they've gone through and they become so different genetically that they can no longer produce viable offspring. So when we discuss speciation events, we talk about a reduction of gene flow, and sometimes it doesn't require a geographic barrier. If we look at all these bugs here, all of these bugs go through and they have the ability to reproduce with each other. However, the distance that they go through and separate themselves, and because of their geographic location and the size, is going to have an influence on their reproduction. So if we zoom in here to these bugs on the left and we go through and we look at this red bug here, well, all of these bugs in this left-hand column have the ability to reproduce. They have an 80% chance of reproducing because they're very, very close in proximity. Now, the further out we go, well, the bugs on this very left edge have a smaller probability of going and reproducing with the bugs in the middle because they're further away. And the further out we go, the probability is further reduced. There's a 0% chance that the bugs on the left end are going to reproduce with the bugs on the right end because they are so spread apart. So again, after many generations of natural selection, what we go through and see are all of these different homogeneous populations that go through and occur and are layered within this environment. So what we're really just beginning to discuss is this reduction of gene flow and how these genes are passed along and how they have an influence on these populations. So what we can see from this is we have an original population, and an isolation event is going to occur within that population. And what this is ultimately going to result in is a speciation event. And we can see as time goes through and occurs, and as natural selection goes through and plays with the organisms, what we see is different species arise amongst the animal and plant kingdoms. Alright, so did you guys learn? Well, did you learn a couple of things? Did you guys learn again about what a species is and how we go through and define that? Did you guys go through and learn how speciation goes through and occurs? And then lastly, did you kind of go through and have an introduction to what events cause speciation? This is going to be the end of the video. I will see you all in class tomorrow.